Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the event. We're so excited to have you. And I am thrilled to be here. So, to introduce myself, my name is Faisal Alani. I am the head of global partnerships at the Collective Intelligence Project. I was also previously a non-resident scholar at the Planetary Politics Initiative at New America, and also a previous research fellow at the Global Center on AI Governance, which will come up again very shortly. I got my start in this field called ICT for D, which is essentially international development and tech. And in this field, I got to live in a lot of different countries, and I got to examine a lot of digital rights issues, look at how technology was impacting education and healthcare and politics in a lot of different contexts, especially in the majority world. And a lot of what I noticed was problems that have kind of always persisted in technology. International digital divides, the localization of emerging tech. And a lot of the stuff back then was about social media. It was about misinformation and disinformation. After the AI boom, things started to change a little bit in that, uh, you know, new technologies, but same problems. And I was very attuned to this given my experience with ICT for D. And I was always on the lookout for people that were talking about this in this space, particularly with AI governance. And that's when I came across the great Rachel Adams's work, who is joining us here today. Rachel is the CEO and founder of the Global Center on AI Governance and a senior research fellow at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. Rachel wrote an incredible book recently called The New Empire of AI. I love this book. I read it as soon as it came out, and I reference it so much in my own work around global governance, around looking at AI in the global south. And I'm so thrilled to be able to talk to Rachel about this book. So, to get things started, Rachel, I think we're all very curious. Why did you write this book?
Hi everybody, and Faisal, thank you so much, and thank you very much to Planetary Politics with New America. It's really exciting to be kind of doing the America launch of this book with you all. Um, okay, so you ask a really interesting question. Why did I write this book? And I think very often when you work on a project that you do over a number of years, the reasons why you do it changes and evolves. And one of the things that happened with me as I was writing this book, which started out as an article exploring whether AI could be decolonized, which I worked on in 2020. And that was when the seeds of this idea around examining the colonial impulses and the colonial histories embedded within artificial intelligence became a topic of really serious interest and I think concern to me. But as I was writing or starting to write and work on this book, the issues that I was writing about suddenly became more and more urgent. And I think even more so now that it's published and out, and it was published at the end of 2024, these issues have become even more critical, not just in terms of new evolutions in technologies like AI agents becoming more popular. And the kind of major turning point for me as I was writing was, um, the arrival of generative AI capabilities and foundation models and ChatGPT, which produced this whole new layer of what I was trying to analyze and explore. But also, I suppose more recently, the political conditions of the geopolitical conditions and the political conditions of our current world order that I think are intimately connected to the issues that I'm exploring in this book. So, yeah, originally I was really interested and concerned to explore how colonial practices were or tendencies were embedded within AI technologies and the historical roots, particularly around things like cybernetics, biometrics, statistics, and the kind of colonial management of populations particularly through statistics and biometrics. And then the kind of concept and ideal of intelligence and the role that that played within Western colonialism. So those were the ideas I was kind of originally spending a lot of time on. But as the work grew and as my own work, particularly around understanding the or exploring and engaging with impacts and implications of artificial intelligence on the African continent, working with a lot of governments across the continent, and just seeing how powerful the narrative was around AI is going to make the world a significantly better place for everybody. And particularly that narrative being connected to a set of GDP figures. So PricewaterhouseCoopers published this report. I talk about it in the introduction to the book called Seizing the Prize. And it was talking about the growth that AI will bring to GDP, which has significantly increased since they published this with generative AI, and where the kind of global distribution of this GDP growth would be. And I suppose for PwC, the interest was around how much China would be growing in relation to the US, who would see, the large majority of this prize. The EU, not as significant an amount, but what I was picking up on was this tiny figure of the growth that Africa, and I think at that point Africa was lumped with Oceania and the less developed parts of Asia, what that tiny percentage of growth would be. And these figures were pegged to the year 2030. At the same time, the World Bank had developed a report analysing the conditions of global poverty following COVID-19 that said that by 2030, so that same point in time, PwC has said, we're going to see this major economic transformation. 90% of the world's poor would be residing within the African continent. And I was so interested around how do we reconcile this? How do we reconcile these projections of economic growth with these projections of poverty and where poverty will be located? So that was the kind of basic idea at the heart of the book, connected with how do we understand this phenomenon of global inequality through the history of colonialism as the history which produced global inequality, and what does this trajectory ultimately look like? So the book is, really trying to argue that global inequality is set to increase and widen and worsen because of artificial intelligence and the practices
Mhm.
and politics and economics that are connected to that. And there was still the opportunity to take steps to reverse and change that trajectory, those being policy steps and advocacy and behavioral changes. There's always room to kind of change things, but the first step in doing that is to acknowledge that the trajectory we are on is not a trajectory that is sustainable or equal or just.
There's so much to unpack there, and I want to dive into to each element. And I want to start with this sense of urgency you talk about, maybe in a political and government context. So, like you said, there's a prevalent government perception that AI is this panacea for all of a nation's problems, right? Be it national security or economic prosperity. How how grounded are in reality are a lot of these assumptions that governments make?
Yeah, and I think, Faisal, to kind of respond to this question, I'm going to talk about how governments, particularly in the majority world, are seeing the role of AI as a panacea, but also how it's being placed on them.
Hmm.
So, and this was something that has really only kind of intensified and accelerated in the past few years. And one of the things I spend time discussing in the book is how Elon Musk has presented AI as something. Bletchley Park, the UK's first AI safety summit. He positioned AI as something that would not just enable everybody to have a universal minimum income, but a universal high income. And then
mm,
Demis Hassabis has also been quoted as talking about AI as this meta solution to some of the world's greatest challenges and problems that we see. And poverty is one of the most significant challenges that we have not yet been able to overcome. And it's a challenge that is particularly significant for governments in the global south. So when you have a technology or a solution or an idea that is presented as going to enable significant economic growth and transformation very rapidly, it's very hard to turn that down. It's a very attractive and
mm,
compelling idea. I think, there's a couple of things there. One is that a lot of the work that I've been doing and leading over the past few years has really unpacked how little evidence there is that AI will have this significant transformative economic, social benefit for countries outside of the West. And this is for a number of reasons that I don't think
mm,
it will fulfill on its promise. Some of those being we don't have the adequate infrastructure, digital infrastructure. Some of those being that we don't have that the solutions are not being designed to solve the particular problems at hand. I think that is one of the critical ones too. But at the same time, it's a very dangerous promise that AI is making, because it's unevidenced and because it is so costly to build. So governments and nations and contexts in the global south are already kind of challenged digitally and trying to address basic kind of digital divide, even basic electricity issues. So
mm,
to say to them, we need to invest billions of dollars to build up the infrastructure needed to then be able to use AI in a way that's going to be significantly transformative is a bet, right? It's a kind of Faustian bargain. Do we want to put that much money and emphasis behind something that we don't know is going to pay off in the right way? So I think that's one of the themes that's unpacked in the book is this disjuncture between the narrative and the promise of
mm,
artificial intelligence and just how much work would need to be done, just how big that gap is between how ready many contexts across Africa, for example, are to hook on to that promise and to make it kind of something that's a reality. And then I think the kind of thing that's coupled onto this is that even if you saw that massive economic boost, who would have it? Who would benefit from it? There's nothing that's
mm,
inherently inclusive about economic growth, particularly in kind of capitalist societies. So when we're thinking about transforming everybody's lives and we're thinking about this really egalitarian promise, and then you have a set of kind of market structures that have no way of fulfilling on such an egalitarian promise, there's also a massive gap. So some of the really kind of exciting AI solutions that are being presented for particular issues in developing contexts, whether that's for kind of agriculture or it's for, in health context to bring about better health outcomes or ensure more people have access to the health services they need. These are not solutions that are sustainable without donor, philanthropic, or
mm,
government investment. They're not solutions that will be solved by the market. So it's a different kind of set of issues that are involved there. And again, it's about kind of unpacking that disjunction, that gap between what's promised and what it would actually take to realize that.
Do you do you think the perception is that AI itself is the perceived solution for poverty, or the money that AI generates?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it's both. I think Demis, I think Hassabis's idea was that it was AI itself, right? So it was being able to make such significant advances in statistical processing that we are able to understand complexities within data that humans had not been able to understand before, and therefore be able to help solve these major issues. And I think kind of drug discovery and some of the things with AlphaFold are some of
Hmm.
the most amazing examples we have of how machine intelligence can surpass what humans would ever be able to do, but ultimately bring about societal wide global benefits. So
Hmm.
there's a really obvious example, but it's not entirely clear apart from the connection with, once you solve health issues, you enable people to have a greater and a better foundation for prosperity. How that itself will solve poverty is not entirely clear to me. I think potentially what Elon Musk was talking about, but wouldn't know quite enough when he's talking about universal high income, is potentially the kind of productivity gains and the economic gains that if anyone had access to these technologies, they're able to do far more, produce far more. And yes, it's a kind
Mhm.
of immediate and individual economic gain. But that relies on who has access to these technologies, who's able to use them. And that goes to a different aspect of the AI divide. The AI divide is something I talk about quite a lot, and it's not quite the same as the digital divide, which is very much about who has access to these technologies and who doesn't. And that's important when we're talking about generative AI capabilities and we're thinking about who, in an
Mhm.
individual capacity, is able to use these to get ahead educationally, to get ahead, to be able to access the knowledge they might need to be able to do whatever they wanted to do. But the AI divide is more complex than that. And it's really about who benefits from this kind of global setup of artificial intelligence, this kind of planetary manifestation of it, and who pays the price. So it's also about, who's paying the cost. And much of the analysis that's gone into the book around the material conditions, the material reality of artificial intelligence is really trying to put a human face behind
Mhm.
who pays the price, who pays the cost for those of us who are privileged to be able to access and use ChatGPT to be able to use it for our benefit.
I really like the way that you phrased this in the book. You talked about AI's material body, and I love the framing of that because the public perception of AI obscures that intricate web of exploited resources and labor that it takes to operate AI. What do you think it will take to reconceptualize AI's material body so that we can actually hold these mechanisms of production more accountable?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important aspects of the debate at the moment, partly because the debate around AI governance and AI safety does not capture some of the broader supply and value chain issues at the heart of this kind of global material body of artificial intelligence. So as it stands, we do not really have mechanisms by which to hold to account this kind of violent, extractive, exploitative global value chains of artificial intelligence. So maybe just kind of explain some of them or
Hmm.
bring them to life a little bit. We have kind of very often when we think about artificial intelligence, we think about it as something really ephemeral. It's in the cloud. It's not actually real. It's not physically real. But of course it is. And it's made up of all this kind of hardware from undersea cables to drones to phones to smartphones, and then to massive, massive, massive data centers. And all of this requires rare and raw earth minerals, um, particularly for smartphone batteries, things like lithium and cobalt that come from kind of vulnerable, sensitive parts of the world. And those parts of the world, so particularly Democratic Republic of Congo, where cobalt for smartphone batteries is becoming exponentially more valuable and more needed and more extracted, that country's not becoming politically more stable. Those people that are involved in that industry are not benefiting in any way. In fact, it's harming them because there's a lot of kind of indentured labor or even slavery or even children's labor that's involved in the extraction of these resources. And one of the things I spend a bit of time talking about in the book is how these countries where the very basic minerals from which the global kind of materiality of AI comes from don't see benefit from these minerals that they kind of house and give birth to within their soil because of these kind of old colonial industrial routes which
Mm.
take these minerals immediately out of the country and process and refine them elsewhere. And their kind of productive value, their real kind of economic value is when they've been processed and refined and then they're kind of created into whatever they're shaped and created in those factories. And AI really exploits this, and it exploits this on such a significant level. And the DRC is one of the kind of richest countries in the world from a mineral level, and AI is the biggest industry, the wealthiest industry in the world, yet it's
Yeah.
one of the poorest countries. And I feel like we've pointed this out before, and there's a brilliant book. I must remember the name of it. It's about something like the Red Country or something that points to this absolutely stark fact. But part of what is needed is to bring these stories to life more, to plant them more in Western media, so that those of us who are in the West and do have kind of choices around the technologies we use or want to be informed about the implications of how, every time we use ChatGPT, it's like pouring out a bottle of water. Very few people know that. And if they knew that, they might make different decisions.
Mm.
Um, and then the other one I kind of talk about, and there's a lot in between. So I'm talking now about the kind of beginning of the value chain with the extraction of the minerals, and then right at the end of the value chain, you have the dumping of old electronics that have fulfilled their value for someone. So sort of smartphones and fridges and plugs, when the EU says, they want to standardize all their plugs, these physical things go somewhere and they get dumped somewhere. So chapter 3 of the book talks about the places where these old electronic artifacts get dumped, and the kind of really significant health issues that they pose for the communities that live in these areas. Very often people that are really trying to extract any last piece of copper or value from any of these old fridges and old electronics. But it's a peculiarly, that's not quite the right word, it's a strangely regulated space as well, because there are laws around e-wastage and where countries in the EU or in America can in North America can dump these old electronics, and there's a kind of loophole here that says, if they're not if they can be reused, or if they're faulty but not completely broken, you can go and take them to a country that's willing to take them, like Ghana in this case, and then that country will be able to kind of fix them and sell them and use them. But in reality, these things are completely unsalvageable, or the local kind of communities do not have the tools to be able to use them or reuse them. So there's some sort of crazy statistics about the amount of e-wastage that's produced in the West in relation to the amount produced in the global south, yet it all gets dumped in the global south because
Mhm.
countries are able to kind of manipulate their way around these international laws.
You do such an excellent job in the book of laying the groundwork for how the history of all of these colonial dynamics has led to these imbalances nowadays. Particularly, I remember an example of how you reference scholars that talk about how, for instance, in South Africa, apartheid did not actually end, it just became privatized, and how that pattern plays out with AI and colonial economics at a geopolitical level. I I I want to dive deeper into that, but I also want to make sure that we have time to talk about majority world contexts in and of themselves.
Mm.
So the implementation of AI in these contexts, and a point you make in the book about how they often fail. Why do they often fail in majority world contexts? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons behind this. I've spoken a little bit about how the digital infrastructure doesn't immediately exist to be able to, or the data infrastructure does not exist to be able to layer on this machine learning capability on top of it and then be able to kind of produce out efficiencies within health systems or public service. If you don't have digital record keeping and your data is not in a machine readable format, you can't get those benefits. It requires a lot of kind of work to do this. We also know that large language models, foundation models, ChatGPT and the like, are just not as effective in non-Western contexts. And I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs and innovators across the global South, particularly across Africa, who have a lot of work to do to fine tune and refine these models to be able to produce kind of African sensitive, African relevant outputs. So one of the things that's spoken about in the book is about these journalists who use ChatGPT within kind of the Congo or Uganda, and every time they ask ChatGPT to kind of write something about any of their political leaders, and every African leader, the immediate response is something to do with corruption. Even Mandela is associated with corruption. And they said, King Leopold II is fairly described.
Mhm.
So just really kind of obvious, terrible, terrible stereotyping that goes on there, which just means that they're not as relevant and as useful in these contexts. And then I think there's also the kind of public understanding and literacy around AI. So one of the things we've done recently, and it's not yet published, but my organization, the Global Centre on AI Governance, a sort of global think tank, but based in South Africa, very Africa focused, has worked with the South African Human Sciences Research Council and their South African Social Attitude Survey to do a really comprehensive survey on South African perceptions and attitudes towards artificial intelligence. And this is really the first deep dive public perception survey on AI in Africa. We're thinking about, how do we scale it to other African countries? How do we ask questions about AI in a way that is relevant to most people? And we found, I mean, I can't go into that much detail about it, but one of the headlines is that, people have a very low understanding of artificial intelligence, don't know often when it's being used in their lives. And this is another reason why I think we will fail and it's not sustainable when we're talking about building AI ecosystems in Africa. We're talking a lot about how we invest in this, how we grow them. We don't talk about the public side. We talk about universities and research labs and governments, but very often we fail to talk enough about the communities and the communities that are affected and the communities we should be designing solutions for, and the people that will hold their policymakers their political leaders to account. So one of the studies that I explored and talk about in the book is a study that Human Rights Watch undertook in Jordan. And it was a really, really fascinating study that explored the impacts of a AI tool that the World Bank had used with the government to determine who was eligible for cash transfers. So really kind of important a really important thing in people's lives. And what Human Rights Watch did, which was really novel and is not being done enough, is they went to the communities where this was used, and interviewed people about what their experience was in using these systems. And it sounds so kind of banal, but it's just we're not doing enough of that. We're not seeing enough of that. We're not asking enough. What did this do for you? Was this helpful? What did you think about it? So I think there's a huge amount of unsustainability if we're not doing that. And the study was really, really informative about how, if somebody had their dad's 40-year-old car that they were able to drive around in, but still earned, less than $50 a month, something that couldn't feed their family. The very fact that they had a car would eliminate them from being eligible for the system. Or there were people that said, you had to phone this hotline or get on this app, and they had to take a bus to somewhere which cost them X amount and make a phone call and get data which cost all this amount. And so by the time they eventually got access to the system, they'd spent so much money that the money they might have got through a cash transfer, just seemed it seemed utterly meaningless in the end. So I think, yeah, the other side of your question, why do AI solutions often fail, is also where do they succeed in ways
Mm.
that is not necessarily beneficial? And one of the ways that I think they are succeeding very well is in platform economies and the numbers of
Mm.
people that are becoming recruited as gig workers on these platforms across the continent, very often migrant workers. Very few have any kind of labor protections, often working multiple jobs. The point is, it's not a pathway out of poverty.
Mhm.
Yet it's presented as, we're here bringing all these jobs.
What you just said is so close to my heart. I talked about how I was in ICT for D. I'm also a community organizer, and so I get to work a lot with people. And I remember this was like in 2021 or 2022. I used to try to hold these like citizenship assemblies where I'd invite just kind of everyday people to come in and try to talk to them about AI. Exactly what you said. How do you use AI? This. And Rachel, I swear you could see tumbleweeds in the hallways and the gyms because no one would come. Not that they didn't care, but because everyday people have a lot of other priorities, right? They're not thinking about AI the same way that governance architects are. And I want to get into governance because it's a big theme of this whole conversation, right? Like, are we actually in tune with what people prioritize and want? A lot of what you're getting into. But one thing that you had mentioned, kind of in terms of how incompatible or culturally incompatible LLMs can be, English dominated data sets like Common Crawl are probably a big part of that problem, right? Because they're very Western centric, they're very just English dominated. What are ways to diversify those data sets so that LLMs are more representative of other cultures and contexts?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of really important work across certainly the African continent, across the majority world, that's investing in building large language models in local African languages. So that's absolutely one way in which we can get systems and models that are able to produce culturally relevant outputs. I think we need to ensure that this moment where we recognize that we don't have enough representative data, we don't have enough data from these contexts, particularly the kind of experiences of African women in particular are left out of a lot of internet data that these models are trained on. But when we're going to kind of fill those data gaps, we need to do it in a way that's privacy protecting, that empowers people. It's not an opportunity to kind of double down on data colonialist type of practices of exploitation and extraction. And I think that can very easily happen under the name of we're making these technologies more diverse and therefore more ethical. And we've seen this in the past. So we've seen, Chinese companies coming into Zimbabwe and buying the whole database of the biometric database of passport photos in order to train their facial recognition technologies to be more accurate on African faces. So I think that when we're thinking about how do we make these technologies more representative, more reflective of diverse cultures, we need to entrust it to local groups and local developers to do that work and to do that work sensitively, and in ways that empower and ensure that the rights of communities from whom often it's kind of voice data or language data is being extracted are really being upheld. Masakani Research Foundation in Africa is doing this work very, very well.
Um, you talk a lot about kind of colonial dynamics in terms of the diffusion of AI, and you're just talking about tech companies kind of coming into different countries and trying to implement AI in a way that is culturally compatible or responsible. I think lately we've seen a lot of projects and initiatives from different companies talking about how, responsible AI for the world, or we need global governance. And I think there's kind of this underlying narrative in all of that, that the West is kind of the only one capable of developing AI responsibly.
Hmm.
Is the pursuit of responsible AI then just another exertion of soft power? Of this idea that, we're the ones that need to be on the top so that we can save everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting question that I explore a little bit in the book. I don't think it's necessarily responsible AI, and a lot of the work that we're trying to do at the Global Centre on AI Governance, particularly with the project you were involved in, Faisal, with the Global Index on Responsible AI, is give responsible AI a definition and a content and a
Hmm.
context that comes from much more kind of global perspectives. I think where we run into a problem is around the greater or the so-called greater existential AI risks, where we're seeing a move away from open source technologies, which are so important for enabling more and more people, particularly from the global south, to use these models, to adjust the weights, to build them in ways that are locally compatible, because of this narrative and this argument that says that AI is AI in its frontier form poses enormous global universal risks to the human population, and those risks are not well specified apart from AI being kind of connected into some system where it can detonate a nuclear power plant or something. And so because of the complexity of these systems and understanding their capabilities and then securing their capabilities from unauthorized access, only a small set of companies should be entrusted with this mega power. And that's a really self-serving narrative. It's a very kind of problematic and self-serving narrative. So that is unpacked a
Hmm.
little bit in the book, and how this feeds into an economic kind of pursuit and enables market monopolies as well for these big tech players, because only a few have that kind of trusted power to do it in the right way and use it well.
This is so interesting. I want to ask one more big question, and then I'll get to some audience ones. A big theme of this entire talk in your book is kind of around this geopolitical aesthetic of AI. particularly, this colonial imbalance that you've mentioned quite a bit. How is the rhetoric around the majority world needing to catch up on AI research and development harmful? And how can we change that? How how do we tell better stories about AI in general and ones that incorporate the majority world?
Yeah, I think these are two really, really, really interesting questions. And the catch-up narrative is not new, right? It's the history of kind of enlightenment and development that we need to be helping these less civilized nations catch up to the ideal state of nationhood that is represented by the West. I don't think the West is now able to represent that kind of idealized liberal democracy anymore. So that's
Hmm.
on the one side of it is that it presents this ideal of this world governed with AI in a way that is presented as an unquestioned ideal. So I think we have to ask, is that where we want to be going? Is that the future we also aspire to across these very diverse contexts? I think, when we talk about the majority world, what's so powerful is to remember that this is like 85% of the world. This is the majority. There's so much political power behind
Yeah.
stating it as this fact of this is the majority of the world that we're talking about here. Um, so I think together with that kind of we need to catch up is we need to scale, we need to see these things scaled and there's a lot in the book that talks about this kind of principle of scale that's embedded within the very architecture of artificial intelligence that is almost inherently imperial. And I
Hmm.
think when we look at where do we see these examples of AI done right, I'm not sure we're ever looking at examples where there's billions of users. Very often that's where it goes wrong, and there's kind of pockets of authoritarianism or violence and bullying, complex things. I think where we see good examples of AI, it's in discrete, small, focused, community-built cases. And what we're interested in there is probably not scale, it's some form of reproducing it elsewhere or deepening the engagement with communities or responding better to community needs or replicating it. It's not necessarily scale. So I think that there's a lot of adjusting of our approach and perspective behind what we expect or
Hmm.
what we kind of assume nations and communities and groups across the majority world want to see these futures with AI being. And then I think the other issue is the gap is so blooming large that we're
Yeah.
never going to catch up to where the US is at. I don't think Sweden will catch up to where the US is at. China is still really far from where the US is at. So the fact that, the US is so worried about China, where there's still a significant gap, is interesting. But, these technologies are so costly to produce, so costly, requiring so many resources that we're never going to catch up in quite the same way. So we need to redefine that quite significantly.
I really appreciate your kind of proposed theory of change around gathering collective input. It's very resonant with my own work right now at the Collective Intelligence Project and something I firmly believe in. I want to dive into some audience questions here, particularly around two that I think pair well together. So I'm just going to read them as is and then kind of quickly summarize. One person says, as an undergrad researching ethical AI and tech policy, how can we avoid perpetuating global power imbalances in AI while still engaging in the field? So we have the student perspective, and then someone else says, I live in Silicon Valley, and founders who are building AI companies and big tech leaders are not concerned about these issues. So what can I do about it? What should my theory of change be? And so you have this, from a student coming into the field and someone probably deeply embedded in it. How do you think both should take kind of a lot of these lessons that we've been talking about, incorporate it?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for those really kind of sensitive questions. I think that what we want is more people engaged in this space that have an awareness of contexts outside of the ones in which they live and they see, and the implications and impacts of what AI is doing outside of, the West and these quite privileged contexts often, because the more, that we need almost like a movement in order to counter this, like the forces propelling us towards an AI-driven future. As the person from Silicon Valley emphasized, in Silicon Valley, this is not something that is a concern or being thought about. Instead, it's this kind of pursuit, which is not just a pursuit for its own gain, but a pursuit that's coupled with this is going to benefit everyone everywhere. And that's where it becomes really dangerous because we're speaking on behalf of other people whose contexts we're not building technologies for
Hmm.
or even engaging with them in the design or the governance of these technologies. So having awareness is always the kind of first step. And on the kind of governance space, I think it's also a matter of thinking about what are the governance needs in very different parts of the world. What is the implications of doing this and not that elsewhere? What do we know? What does the research and evidence show us from how AI is being used in these very different contexts, and just thinking about it from a more nuanced and global perspective. I think I talk in the book a little bit about what might be a kind of multicultural global ethics of
Hmm.
AI. And I think we must also remember that much as this space seems to be moving very, very fast, it is still new. It is still emerging. We're still emerging our kind of consciousness around what the ethical questions are, what the ethical quandaries and issues are. And this book is really supposed to be a kind of provocation to get anybody who's interested in reading it thinking a little bit more, or having a sense of what it might look like in South Africa or Kenya or Nigeria,
Hmm.
or places that are not so seen um, from the West, or so forth.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of the book actually is that you have so many concrete examples from all these countries that I often cite whenever I write articles or I engage in meetings. So really appreciate that. Um, let's dive a little bit deeper into, we talked a lot about these kind of community-oriented solutions. Someone in the audience asked, what regulatory approaches are or will be most needed to kind of encapsulate what you're talking about, or seize the benefits of AI while minimizing risks to human rights or health?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think the kind of debates around regulation are quite tricky now because the EU put out a regulation. They put out the EU AI Act. And from kind of the perspective where I come from, which is very much a kind of human rights lens, and we need to be putting out a rights-based approach to regulation, where fundamentally what we want to do is protect and uphold human rights that may be at risk from the use of these technologies. And the EU AI Act effectively did that. I mean, I think part of where it may fail is with the risk-based approach, which doesn't always enable those who are not making the decision about whether something is a risk or not to get involved and to seek justice. That may be harder, but the kind of impact of that has been that the US has really pushed back and said they're not, some um, big players in the AI space don't want to engage with Europe anymore, and are really putting pressure on other regions in the world not to go the regulatory route
Hmm.
that Europe has gone. And certainly, I was one of the lead drafters of the African Union's continental strategy on AI, and there was a lot of deliberation about where regulation should sit. Um, And we don't want to create too high a compliance burden through regulation that then disenables local entrepreneurs to get involved and we can't get away from this very centralized, monopolized model. Um, but at the same time, I think firstly there are existing laws that have absolute relevance in addressing the harms and risks associated with AI. So, really, just kind of standard constitutional and human rights laws and frameworks have a really important role. And some of the work we're doing is engaging with human rights officers across Africa and engaging with them about how AI impacts on different human rights. But I think the other problem we face is that AI is such a kind of differentiated um, technology that we're not. It's going to be difficult to have an omnibus law that regulates it in its entirety.
Hmm.
Um, So I think we're going to move into more sectoral based regulation of these technologies. We're going to kind of see in the health space, we know there's kind of particular issues, there's particular existing laws and structures that I think as AI regulation evolves, will just become slightly more kind of positioned within these different sectors. From a kind of African perspective, there's so much more fundamentally that needs to be done around data governance before AI governance becomes the really pressing issue. And there's ways in which even kind of data protection laws or data governance frameworks can help address some of the inequity issues. So by requiring people to be educated and build literacy around the impacts of AI on privacy when you're asking for consent or public procurement laws that's requiring kind of working with local entrepreneurs and local providers if they've got a certain kind of
Hmm.
history and they've got certain sustainability or gender equity things going for them. So I think that there's probably more creative and innovative ways we can be approaching this question of governance for equity. It's certainly an issue that the Global Centre on AI Governance is really, really interested in. And my colleague Fola Adeleke has written a paper around what does outcomes-based governance of AI
Wow.
look like. I think this is really, really interesting. If we have a set of outcomes that we want in terms of fairness and equity and justice, and we focus less on the procedural aspects and much more on was this or wasn't this outcome achieved. But I think there may be a lot of pushback from big tech. We're seeing this with the impacts of the EU AI Act, and I think it's probably a long road ahead when it comes to the question of AI governance.
Yeah, you use data protection as an example here. I want to give you a chance to talk about something that I know that you're very passionate about with regard to another sector of AI that needs to be very governed, and that's biometrics. You mentioned this earlier, you talk about it a lot in your book, and I think it relates to this question in that, well, first, just to kind of lay the groundwork, how would you say that biometric markets exploit vulnerable populations, and where do you see the largest risk as these technologies continue to evolve, which kind of goes back to then how do you see them being governed?
Yeah, I mean, biometrics, I think, is a really, really interesting technology. Even just the kind of history of it, it has a particular history within the history of the apartheid state of South Africa. It's really interesting work from people like Keith Breckenridge that's explored some of these issues. And it really was kind of a way of managing and controlling and monitoring groups and populations by being able to perfectly and precisely identify someone. And it's often something that's done absolutely at scale. We're talking about
Hmm.
whole populations having the most personal aspect of your information because you cannot deny it. There's really interesting work from people like Simone Brown about how biometrics is like your body being a passport and it can it can testify against you because you might want to be able to hide something, but you can't choose to hide something. Instead, you're forced to admit your very fact of being. So it's a very, very interesting kind of technology from some of these perspectives. And it has a complex history, with the Aadhaar in India or with WorldCoin in Kenya, which was Sam Altman's venture. And I talk about how in the book WorldCoin attracted their first 500,000 users from the global south. So it's often these kind of new exploratory technologies that are tested in the global south where there's less visibility, less regulation. The collateral damage doesn't matter politically and economically as much.
Hmm.
And they kind of bribe people with iPods or AirPods or $50 of crypto coin to give their iris for this world coin promise, which was supposed to be a kind of global crypto market. And the Kenyan authorities clamped down on it at one point around privacy issues and violation of their Data Protection Act. And then those charges were dropped and WorldCoin has come back. So this happened since I
Hmm.
published the book. But I think it's never just an identity system in and of itself. Even the Aadhaar was about the stack and creating kind of economic and financial opportunities layered on top of that, and the degree to which a government could enact forms of surveillance over people. So for me, biometrics is just so inherently an act of power and of enabling somebody who has access to this, or a body that has access to this kind of database to have ultimate power over people. So I think there's always some kind of secondary opportunity
Hmm.
for particular groups that are behind these huge, big biometric endeavors. And very often people don't know enough about the kind of privacy implications for them behind kind of giving up certain biometric markers.
I'm kind of I'm actually upset that I asked this last because I have so many questions with that, namely how people can take back agency from these types of technologies, or another big one it would be if you could write the book now after these past few months of emerging technologies, what would you have updated? But we only have 1 minute left, and there's actually someone asked this question. I think it's a great way to end. This is kind of putting you on the spot, but I'm happy to help. Can you give me a sentence that summarized the doctrine that you believe your book is grounded in? This person came away with shared human flourishing.
Oh,
Do you have anything
wow.
off the top of your head?
Oh, well, that is yeah, I love that. I mean, I think there's Faisal, you really kind of pointed at it just a moment ago, but it's really about human agency in this collectivized world that AI is very much about. AI doesn't care about the individual, it cares about the collection that can be kind of manipulated and used and predictive models based on it. So I think, I'm probably too late in the day for me to give you a really good sentence immediately, but it would be something about reclaiming human agency to decide one's own future and what that meant.
That was perfect. That's beautiful. Rachel, thank you so much for being here. That was so informative and excellent. Again, everybody, I cannot recommend The New Empire of AI enough. I always reference it, and I know you will too if you get a chance to read it. Pick it up at your local bookstores. Online, we'll have a link in the description. Airports, gas stations, I don't know where books are
I don't
sold.
think so.
No, you'll find it. But thank you, Rachel. And yeah,
Thank you so much.
appreciate everyone for being here. Yeah.